So today we're going to talk about the last West and the New South. So the last West is taking place during the same years as the Civil War and into the 1870s and 80s. And while the Civil War is kind of happening and Reconstruction is taking place, at the same time, the continuity of Native American resistance and conflict is still existing, but this time it's happening in the Great Plains. During the Civil War, you learned about the Homestead Act and how there was this great push to try and give free land to Americans in the Great Plains. So in the Dakotas and Kansas and Montana and Wyoming. And in order to do that, that's where a lot of Native Americans, especially the Plains Indians, who have kind of resorted to a nomadic lifestyle. And that's going to present a lot of conflict. And so the reason it's called the Last West is that even though we've started with Jamestown and, Native conflict that way and resistance, by this point in time, the last resistance takes place. And that's going to end at Wounded Knee Creek. And so that's going on in the West. At the same time, we're also looking at the effects of Reconstruction. And the effects of the effects of the end of Reconstruction is probably a better explanation. And that's why I really like to teach this chapter right after Reconstruction. It meshes pretty seamlessly. Today, we're going to look at the farmers as well as how farmers are living in the West and how they're living in the South during these years up until 1900. So let's talk about the settlement of the West. So before 1860, before the Civil War, a lot of Americans are passing the Great Plains, like we even call them like the flyover states today, right? People fly from the East Coast or the Midwest over all the way to like California or the Pacific Northwest. And that's what a lot of the settlers were doing. So, we talked about the Oregon Trail and the California Gold Rush. They're skipping over the plains. And they're doing so for a few reasons. The land in Oregon and California presented more economic opportunities. So you have fertile land in Oregon, you have the gold mines in California, some pretty fertile soil there as well. But you also have trade because of the coastline. Obviously, the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be built during this time, and that's going to help promote some settlement. But what you're going to realize is in the Great Plains, it's not very suitable for agriculture. And that is what people deem as like the American dream, is that they own land and they grow, that they're self-sufficient and they grow crops and they can sell those and make money and purchase goods. But the Great Plains lack trees. They typically receive less rainfall, weather extremes, so really cold winters with blizzards, because remember, you don't have like mountain ranges and forests to kind of like break up those weather systems because they're so flat. The summers can be very dry and hot, and drought was a big issue for these people. In addition to that, you have 15 million American bison that are roaming these lands. Now, they provide food, clothing, and shelter for roughly 250,000 Native Americans. So these are the Sioux tribe, the Comanche, the Lakota, among others. And what's interesting is by 1900, the buffalo population is going to be nearly extinct because of human interaction. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Also during this time, as more people move out, these open lands that were used for like free range, if you will, that's kind of how we associate today, are going to be closed off with ranches and homesteads. In addition to that, rail lines are going to connect a lot of these different towns. And during these years, the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma are going to be created. And some of them are going to be, so those states are going to be awaiting statehood. And the image behind me is a sod house. So this is what, because there's no trees, you're kind of limited in how you can build a home. So no log cabins in the Great Plains. Instead, they had these sod houses. So there were a series of gold rushes that take place throughout the mid to late 1800s in kind of like the Rocky Mountain areas like Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, even in the Dakotas, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the Comstock lode was the largest amount of silver that was ever found. Still, even today, they're mining silver in Nevada, for example. What started out as individual prospectors, like what you kind of think of like with the California Gold Rush with those 49ers with like, panning and very simple techniques. By this point, it had evolved with capitalism as capitalism has evolved in the United States and industrialization. And so now you have deep shaft mining. It's very expensive. It required a lot of machinery and a lot of investors. And so these are the people that are really benefiting from this time period. So granted, it's a job for the men that are going to work in these mines, but very dangerous work. But again, and they're like earning wages versus like, hey, I found this, 4 ounces of silver and that's mine to sell and make money on. Now it's the corporations or the owners of the land that are making the money, or the mines. Okay. They would set up these, or as the silver or the gold was found, you would have these boom towns. And so they would come in, they would set up their little, so think of kind of the Wild West, this little like shanty town, right? Saloons, dance halls, because they were so quick, and they were called a boom town because of that. Like they set up very quickly. Not a lot of time to set up like a government, mayors and sheriffs and things like that. So vigilante justice was a thing where people would kind of take it into their own hands, like someone had, done you wrong in some way. And that was the whole like cowboy, Wild West vision that we kind of have in our heads of people, taking it outside and the shooting at each other and all that kind of stuff. There is something to that. There wasn't, it was known as the Wild West, like for a reason. I don't know if it's quite like the old like gunslinging movies, but that was the reality because they popped up so quickly. And a lot of them, as soon as they came up and once the silver was gone or the gold was gone, then everyone left and went to the next town. And so they became ghost towns. Very few of them actually remained towns that established churches and schools and things like that. Some of them did. So San Francisco was one of them, Denver, Colorado, Sacramento, California. But even out west today, there are these old ghost towns where you can kind of see the remnants of the mining towns during this era. Now, with that, there is going to be some discrimination. So a third of the Western miners were Chinese immigrants that started coming over probably after the 1849 gold rush. And there was a lot of hostility for the Chinese, especially in California. So they had their own laws, the miners' tax, where if you were a foreign-born miner, you had to pay $20 a month to even be able to be there. And that was really trying to protect whites in the area or native-born citizens. And again, this is like goes perfectly in line with like the Know Nothing Party and nativism. Even if you think about with the Civil War and you think about abolition and we think about the Free Soilers, remember they wanted all of this territory to be open for their economic opportunity, not for others. And so that plays, it works really well with the same time period, but in particular, they are discriminated against Chinese Americans. So in 1882, for the first time, and the only time in American history, Congress passed a piece of legislation that strictly prohibited Chinese people to immigrate into the United States. And it was this way all the way up until 1965. It's the only piece of legislation that is discriminatory towards one nationality. In more recent years, the United States, like in the last couple of years, actually, the United States has passed or tried to pass legislation. It was deemed unconstitutional to, or I guess it was an executive order, to prohibit the immigration of people from certain countries where like terrorism exists. It was called the Muslim ban. You probably remember it. That's probably pretty close to what this was like, except that the Muslim ban, as it was called, that was not the official phrase, but that's how people kind of called it. It's different because this was an actual country that prohibited, where this was a series of countries. And so that is a major difference. But a lot of people were kind of like trying to reflect and like look at this time period of history and kind of what it represents, because it represents a fear. It's xenophobia. And again, so we are going to look at this political cartoon in the back during the winter break daily doc assignment. And so we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more as to why they were discriminated against. So another popular occupation or industry of the time period, it's really going to turn into an industry, is that of the cattle industry and the beef industry. So 5 million cattle are going to roam the Great Plains, Texas, and basically they're going to move. They're going to go from Texas into um, kind of like Oklahoma and Kansas and other places like that. The railroads are going to, this was smart. So Joseph G. McCoy, built stockyards in this region so that cowboys could take cattle that had been free ranging on the plains that are being, eating and getting beefed up, so that they could go to the stockyards, be loaded onto train cars and taken to Chicago, where they will be slaughtered, and then from there and put in refrigerated rail cars and sent to the East Coast for people to consume and eat. And these long cattle drives, and one of the reasons, if you've ever heard the phrase, it's time to get the hell out of Dodge, they're talking about Dodge City. So Dodge City was a town where one of these stockyards were. It was a pretty popular one. So remember that these cowboys are out on the plains for months at a time as these cattle graze. And so they're kind of isolated. They're, it's just them and, the few guys that are with them. It's dangerous. They're isolated. But when they come into town, they get paid. And they also like to get into trouble. So kind of that Wild West mentality, that's what's going on in Dodge City. And so it oftentimes escalated to some troublemaking. And so that's where that phrase comes from. It's time to get the hell out of Dodge. And so these cowboys, they would be paid about $1 a day. Most of them are African Americans or Mexicans, some of them maybe like some Irish. And because it was a very difficult job, a lot of isolation, danger. And again, their job is to protect the cattle from any type of issues, whether it be weather related, Native American related, people stealing them. That was their job, was to keep them. By the 1880s, those long cattle drives of where they just kind of graze openly and the cowboys are there to kind of watch them, that's going to end. A couple reasons. One is they're going to overgraze. Beef becomes in high demand. Everybody starts getting involved in the beef industry. There's going to be a really bad blizzard and then followed by a drought in 1885 and 1886, where 90% of the cattle that existed died during that time period. And with that, you have homesteaders coming in and ranchers coming in with barbed wire and marking off their land, so it makes it difficult for them to range to graze freely. So instead, you have these large ranchers coming in, buying hundreds, thousands of acres to where their cattle can range on that, and so that's also going to have a negative effect on those homesteaders. Within a couple of decades of this, because of industrialization and urbanization, which we're going to talk about in the next unit, Americans are going to shift their eating habits, where it was primarily when they're looking at meat, it's going to go from like pork and maybe chicken, but now people have access to beef. Because remember, you have to think about, people only ate what they could get around them, and you have to have lots of acres for cattle to graze on. And so if you don't have room for that in upstate New York, which you didn't, they wouldn't have access to it. But now, because of transportation and because of technology, they have access to beef, and lots of it. And so you have this major shift in people's diets. And then that's a whole nother lecture that we could talk about. Okay, so the Homestead Act, we've talked about a few different times. This was something that the Republicans was a part of their political platform in the 1850s, late 1850s, and then also some of the things that they were able to accomplish when Southern states had seceded, right? Remember, they passed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, which allowed for the transcontinental railroads. So the idea was, again, they wanted to encourage people to move west. A lot of already, like California and Washington and Oregon, like there was a desire for people to go there because of fertile land or economic opportunity. But what about the plains area? And they want to try and populate that. And so as a way to encourage people to move there, they gave away free land. 160 acres. It's free to any family that promised to stay there for 5 years. If you stay there 5 years, it's yours after that. In addition to that, they had to make sure that there was a well there and things like that. So to actually create something that would stay. This free land and the expansion of the railroads did entice a lot of thousands of migrants to try and farm that area. But remember that this is a very difficult place to live. Corn doesn't grow as well in South Dakota or in Montana as it does in Iowa or in Indiana. And so even though 500,000 families took advantage of the Homestead Act, 5 times that number purchased their own land because of how much the public lands were given to railroad companies. So what ended up happening, and this is something that I can explain in class when we get back, is the railroads were given a lot of land. And their goal was to sell that off. So if once you have the railroad and once they give away free land, that land is kind of in demand and it makes the price go up. And so that was kind of the goal, is that it would benefit not only the railroads, but also the federal government. And the homesteaders were kind of left hanging out to dry. Sod busters are the ones that, again, are going to build it from the sod bricks. So you dig deep down into the soil, and you get it's almost like sod that people put in their yards. And so you have the dirt that's held on by the roots, and then you can stack them on top of each other. And it's actually a pretty good insulator. Extreme weather, really bad winters, long, hot summers, water was scarce. There's no lumber for fence, and so you would use barbed wire. That was invented by Joseph Glyden in 1874. This was how you would fence your area. And again, the effect of that is it's going to end the open range system. Windmills were mail ordered through catalogs and sent on so basically the railroad at this time was kind of like your Amazon Prime 2-day delivery. You had access to things that you wouldn't have normally had access to because of these mail order catalogs, and using the United States Postal Service and the rail lines to do that. And so you could buy one, and then you could, it's to get the water source, right? So the wind power in order to drill those deep wells so that you could have access to water. Extreme weather is going to cause the failing of a lot of crops. And in addition to that, they're buying new machinery. There's really high shipping rates. Interest rates are really high from the banks. And so 2/3 of all homesteading farms are going to fail by 1900. New techniques were having to be developed in order for the ones that were successful. So dry farming was to plow really deep into the soil where there was more moisture. And they were planting a Russian wheat, which could kind of deal with those frosts and a little bit more temperament. Eventually, so if you think about the effects today, you're gonna have dams and irrigation systems. That's the only way that we can really still use that land for farming today. But they really didn't have that ability back at that time period. It was not meant to grow wheat and corn. So one of the last pieces of territory is going to be Oklahoma. Oklahoma was designated as Indian Territory as far back as Andrew Jackson, and think of the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. And in 1889, they decided to open up this territory. This was one of the more interesting things to teach about, was the Oklahoma Land Run. So if any of you are big football fans, you've probably heard of the Oklahoma Sooners. Have a pretty good program. And what they did in order to get this land occupied by white settlers was that they were going to have a race. And it's called the Land Run. So this image that you can see all the horses and the stagecoaches, or not, I guess they would have been wagons, are kind of lined up. And the rules were that you would have to register, and you would be given a flag, okay? Or that you had a certain color. It was registered, and it'd have a number or whatever. And out in Oklahoma, there were 160-acre plots, and there was a white flag planted in I don't know what it was, maybe the northeast corner of each 160 acres. And if you get to that flag and take the white flag out that was numbered and you put your flag in, that's your land. Okay. And then you would like go and register it. And so if you think of Oklahoma, like there are parts that are fertile, your creek sources, water sources was a big one. But the kind of the further north you get and the farther west you get, it kind of gets more dry. And so anyways, there were prime 160 acre plots. And then there were some that were not so much. And so you had this race and people kind of like, you were allowed to like go out and like see which ones you wanted ahead of time. But on race day, like you had to be at the starting line on race day. Now, there were people called Sooners. These were people that were marshals and land surveyors, railroad employees, people that basically kind of cheated and they showed up sooner rather than later. And so they got the best plots of land because they cheated. They were not at the start line. They were miles ahead and already kind of had a head start. And they're like, no, I was here I started when you guys did. And because they knew the right people, they were able to kind of keep that land. And so that's how the Oklahoma Sooners became the Oklahoma Sooners. And you even see like their mascot or whatever is like a guy with a horse and like a wagon. Okay. By 1890, the Census Bureau declared that the entire frontier, except for a few pockets, had been settled. So what happened to the Native Americans? American Indians belonged to dozens of different tribes. So in the Southwest, you had the Pueblo and the Hopi and the Zuni. They're living in those permanent settlements that we talked about way back when in period 1. In the Southwest, you have the Navajo and the Apache. They're nomadic hunters and gatherers. They started to adapt to farming and trading, especially arts and crafts. Navajo art is actually very expensive today. 2/3 of Western tribal groups live on the Great Plains. So the Sioux, the Blackfoot, the Cheyenne, the Crow, and the Comanche. They are nomadic, and they gave up farming long ago when the Spanish introduced the horses. And so they are nomadic. They follow the buffalo. It also helps with kind of like the weather too. So like they would, during the summer months, they kind of move as far up as the border of Canada. During the winter months, they move further south into Texas, and that has been their lifestyle for a couple hundred years now. Well, now that Americans are kind of coming in and white settlers are trying to move into that area, it kind of messes all that up, and it's going to lead to some conflict. So by 1700, the Plains Indians, they're skilled horsemen and hunters, small bands. Again, conflicts in the late 19th century with the US government is partly the result of white Americans having very little understanding of the Plains people and how their tribal units work and the organization of it and the nomadic lifestyle. This is going to lead to a lot of treaties being made and also misunderstood by the Plains Indians, and then broken between the United States government and the Plains Indians. That is a continuity. The United States government makes a treaty, and the Native Americans sometimes ignore it, right? Because without the lack of understanding, if you think about those cultural differences, a lot of cases, though, the United States government breaks the treaty and says, oh, no, you need to sign this new treaty. And so just a lot of inconsistent partnership or cooperation between the two. So as I mentioned earlier, Andrew Jackson and Indian removal started to create reservations in the West, but this was created on the basis of that this land would permanently remain Indian country, that the people would never like settle that area. Because remember, we're talking about in the 1830s where they hadn't quite really realized what waited for them in the West. Because remember, no Texas at this point, none of the Oregon Treaty, the Mexican Cession, none of that existed. And so soon, though, these wagons full of white settlers that are heading to Oregon and the Transcontinental Railroad, like it's causing problems. So one of the earliest treaties is going to be the Fort Laramie Treaty. And it basically said, hey, like tribes, this is your land, and you cannot interact with white settlers. Like you need to stay away from them, and kind of created the reservation system. Most Plains tribes refused to stick to that because, again, they're following the buffalo, and so that didn't really work for them. And so, again, that's going to cause a lot of issues with the American government. In the late 19th century, so the late 1800s, you have the miners and the ranchers and the homesteaders. Now they're coming in. And it's going to lead to a lot of fighting between the United States government, so the U.S. Army, and the Plains Indians. There are going to be a series of massacres. So the Sioux War first started in 1866. This is right after the Civil War. So a lot of Union troops went from, if you decide to stay enlisted, they went from fighting in Virginia to now fighting Native Americans in the West. Gold is going to be found in the Black Hills during this time period, which belongs to the Sioux people per a former treaty. And the miners aren't staying off the land, so this is going to lead to violence. You have the Indian Appropriation Act in 1871 that is going to end the recognition of tribes as this independent nation. So what they're saying is, oh, no, you're not independent anymore. You have to listen to what we say. And it nullified all these previous treaties. And that's what allowed for them to basically come in and negotiate a new treaty that would allow them to take the land. You had the Red River War between the United States and the Comanche that ended with the United States defeating them. And then whenever I say like they defeated them, that means that they are then agreeing to, per the treaty, go on a reservation somewhere. The Second Sioux War with Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. This is going to kind of like a series of battles that you've probably heard about where, for example, the Little Bighorn, which is where a famous Civil War general, Colonel Custer was killed by Native Americans at Little Bighorn in 1876. This is then going to create a lot of animosity between, and a lot of competition. Like the Sioux probably had the most famous resistance of this time period. And the United States government and the United States Army is putting a lot of pressure on these leaders, on these chiefs, to sign away their rights to where they have to go on a reservation. So like Red Cloud surrendered and ended up on a reservation. Crazy Horse was killed during the resistance. Sitting Bull was the last to surrender, but why? He had to surrender because his people, in order to escape American or the United States government's rules and violence that was killing his people, because in numbers, like they just couldn't match up. They actually fled into Canada to try and live in Canada, but the winters were just way too cold and his people were starving and dying. And so they ended up coming back into the United States and going on the reservation. So in addition to the slaughter of the buffalo at this point in time, right? So they were holding like competitions where you could take this train ride and just kill buffalo and they would be left, just to rot, where the Native Americans of this region, they used every single part of the buffalo. Like they didn't waste anything that was their survival. So the buffalo is gone. It's been taken from them. Their land and like the violence there with the United States Army attacking them because they're not on the reservation, that existed. And so they had no food source. And so many of them were forced to end up on a reservation. The last American Indian resistance was through this religious movement of this ghost dance movement. And because it was so bad, there was an outbreak of like yellow fever on some of these reservations that was killing a lot of the children. And so a kind of like a medicine man came forward and said, like, listen, if we do this dance, the buffalo will come back and our relatives will come back and the white man will perish. And then that was like a threat to a lot of whites where they were like, oh my gosh, like, what are they preaching, like death to white people here? And so they brought in the United States military. This is eventually, they killed Sitting Bull as they were trying to arrest him. It was an accident where he was killed. And in December of 1890, they went out to one of these, kind of think of it like in the Christian religion as like a revival. So they'd had this camp set up outside of the reservation where they were doing this ghost dance, and the U.S. Army showed up and killed over 200 Sioux. In history books, you'll see it as the Battle of Wounded Knee. It was a massacre to where, women and children, and the problem was that it snowed that night. So the slaughter happened and then it snowed that night. So you can see this image. Those are all the frozen bodies after the blizzard cleared out. So even if there were people that maybe survived the initial, like the gunshots and things like that, they froze to death. Women, children, babies were found frozen to their mothers in the days after this event. Um, Elderly chiefs, and this was it. After that, the Sioux people were leaderless. So, Sitting Bull was gone, Crazy Horse was gone. Red Cloud was very old. He had not died quite yet, but he's going to die in the coming years. And that was it. They were defeated at that point. And so there will be no more resistance of the Native Americans after Wounded Knee. In addition to that, you had a book by the name of A Century of Dishonor by Helen Hunt Jackson. And what she did is she highlighted the injustices of the American Indian. But what it did, and it's not like, oh, we should be angry at our government. It's like, what do we need to do in order to help them? And their view on how to help them is this belief of assimilation. It created a lot of sympathy for them, which is good. Like, it's much better than the alternative, which was like they're savages, which is how probably the first part of the 1800s, how they viewed Native Americans. And instead they were like, no, like, how can we, like, what's the good Christian thing to do? So kind of reformer-ish, where we need to help them. And so they advocated for education and job training. A lot of them had them, like, especially the Dawes Act, which I'm going to talk about in a second. It tried to get them to be farmers and farm that land. The Carlisle School was in Pennsylvania. There were a series of assimilation schools throughout the East Coast and Florida as well, where children were taken from their parents and were told that their way of life was wrong and inferior, and that if they wanted a future, that they needed to convert to Christianity, to cut their hair, to wear Western clothing, and to basically forget everything that they were taught as children. And they were taken away from their families. It wasn't like an optional thing. Like, this is, some people might have said, like, yes, I want them to go so that they have a future and they're not going to die, in a battle. But it was a very interesting period of time. So the Dawes Act was designed to break up the tribal organizations. So they didn't like the fact that they all looked at Sitting Bull or at Crazy Horse for leadership. Instead, they really wanted to kind of promote this idea of, like, no, like, you're the individual, and egalitarianism, right? And so they're trying to civilize them. So they would divide the tribal lands up into plots of 160 acres. So it kind of models the Homestead Act. And they wanted them to farm in North and South Dakota, which was very difficult. They required them to convert to Christianity. The ghost dance was, like, completely out of the picture. Like, they didn't want them to participate in any of that. And kind of their goal, again, was to assimilate them through legislation. By 1900, you're looking at these reservations, high rates of disease and poverty, alcoholism, suicide. Most of them were living off of the federal government because you couldn't actually make a living as a farmer, especially when you know nothing about it. Because remember, before this, they were nomadic hunters. It was a complete failure. Today, more than 3 million American Indians belong to about 500 tribes. The Sioux reservations alone are plagued by extreme poverty. It's worse than some third world countries. High rates of alcoholism, suicide, depression. COVID-19 has hit the Navajo reservations extremely hard. But again, think of it as these groups are like, they're part of the United States, but they're not. Like, they have that sovereignty. That's why you have all of the casinos popping up, because they've been convinced that that's a way to, like, make more money and create jobs in these areas, because most states have laws that are against gambling. But in reality, it has, they don't have sophisticated healthcare systems. They don't have the education that they need. They don't have the jobs that they need. And even if they're working at those casinos, they're minimum wage jobs and high rates of poverty. Besides the institution of slavery, obviously, when you really look at, like, the poverty among Native Americans today, like, this is another example of just, like, gross discrimination that's had long-term consequences that a lot of people don't understand. So also in the West, the early beginnings of the conservation movement, this will extend into the 20th century for sure, especially with Teddy Roosevelt and his advocacy for it. But there are growing concerns of deforestation that are going to really start this movement. So if you think about people moving in and the new farms and the cutting down of trees and the using of natural resources, as the population grows and expands, obviously that's going to have an effect. So Charles Schurz, Secretary of the Interior in the 1880s, started talking about creating national or like federal parks and forest reserves to protect federal land. So in 1872, you have the first national park of Yellowstone, and Yosemite National Park is going to be formed in 1890. Presidents Harrison and Cleveland are going to reserve 33 million acres of national timber. The Forest Reserve Act will be passed in 1891, as well as the Management Act in 1897. Conservationists believe in scientific management to regulate these natural resources, where preservationists, which is like John Muir, and this might be even some review from environmental science, if you take environmental science, they look at preserving it from human interference. So conservation means like we just need to be aware of what we're using and try to limit that. Preservationists are like, no, like this is not for like human, consumption. And he founded the Sierra Club in 1892, which is one of the first environmental organizations. It is still around today, as is the Audubon Society, and then also they formed Arbor Day. Like I said, President Teddy Roosevelt will kind of take this a few steps further during his presidency in the turn of the century. And we'll learn more about all the way up through like the Environmental Protection Agency. I will say President-elect Biden this week actually announced his nomination for the Secretary of Interior, like who he's going to plan on nominating. And she's a Native American from New Mexico. And that's kind of revolutionary, especially looking at what we just kind of learned about with our history with Native Americans, American Indians, and how they were treated. And then to nominate one for the Department of the Interior really is somewhat historic, because that would be the first time that happened where a Native American would be appointed to that position. So as Native Americans are basically being dominated into submission onto these reservations in the West, the South is still recovering from the Civil War. If you can remember back to the inflation, the destruction from Sherman's March, the toll that it took on the male population between the deaths and the major injuries, if you look at how their economic system had to be reworked in a way where at one point people were using enslaved people as manual labor, and with freedmen, and we already looked at Reconstruction. But when Reconstruction ends, and this is something that you really have to understand, and why I was really focused a lot of time on this in the last chapter, is that after 1877, a lot of things just kind of revert back into a way where you have examples of like legal types of slavery, whether it be economic or political, where it kept African Americans as inferiors. The other thing that I think is interesting for this time period is how difficult it was also for poor whites. And we'll kind of look at that. So Henry Grady promoted this vision of a modern Southern economy. So if you think about the carpetbaggers that came down during Reconstruction to take advantage of the economic mess that it was in, and politically, right? So they could come down, their money went further, there were businesses that needed to be started. They were investors, and also like political aspirations. And so a lot of Northern industrialists looked at the South as a good investment. Some local governments offered tax exemptions to attract businesses and investors to come down. Think about it, there's low wages, right? So that for the labor source, that was a plus. The land, for the most part, was pretty cheap as well compared to the North. And a lot of industries actually did move down. So you are going to have a growth of cities. Railroads are also going to play an important role in helping the South recover a little bit. So cities like Birmingham became the leading producer of steel, Memphis, lumber, Richmond, Virginia, tobacco. North Carolina, even too, this is the same time period where R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company is going to be created in the late 1870s. And one of the reasons that R.J. Reynolds decided to open his tobacco factory here in the town of Winston at the time was because it just so happened that a railroad was connecting these different regions. He felt like it was a good location. He was just over the border in southwestern Virginia, and Winston kind of provided, and also Salem, like the town of Salem, which was very close in proximity, just offered everything that he needed. But it was the railroad that really drew Reynolds to this area. And also, I think a lot of students don't understand, or a lot of people from this area don't know that Winston-Salem at one point in time was the largest, wealthiest city in the state of North Carolina because of during this time. It was actually once even called the city of millionaires. So there you go. In addition to tobacco in Richmond, Virginia, in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, it took over as textile industry factories. 400 cotton mills employed almost 100,000 white workers. There were African Americans that worked in these textile mills, but they were discriminated against. So they always hired whites before. In fact, just outside of Charlotte was called the City of Spindles because there were so many different textile factories that employed so many different people. They were segregated if African Americans did work in those factories. Southern railroad companies converted to a standard. So during the war and before that, they had created their own system, thinking that would benefit them, thinking secession. But they did convert over to standard gauge rails so that they could be used and connect and grow their economy between the North and the West. I could never really figure out why they thought that would be beneficial long term. When you're looking at the rate of growth between 1865 and 1900, it surpassed the rest of the country in population, industry, and railroads. But keep in mind, like it's an interesting statistic, but keep in mind like where it was coming from, right? So the economy grew very quickly. It diversified for sure. But also remember that this is a small percentage of Southerners that are going to be working in factories that are going to benefit from these railroads. The vast majority are still working in agricultural jobs such as sharecropping and tenant farming. It is still by far the poorest region in the country when you're looking at like per capita like spending and growth. But again, Northern investors, like they're the ones investing it too. So it's not like Southerners are the ones getting wealthy off of these new industries. It's predominantly Northerners that are investing in the South. They control 3/4 of the railroads and pretty much control like all the steel industry. Actually textiles, a decent amount of Southerners kind of converted from plantation style, like from a plantation to textile factories. So with that, the profits of these new industries are going to Northern banks and investors. Southern industrial workers, so 94% of them were white. They earn half of the national average, and they work longer hours than in the North because unions had not quite caught on in the South yet, where there were some union control, like in certain states within certain industries, not a lot of unions in the South. They were intimidated and violence and kind of broken up. Most Southerners, white and Black, are going to remain in traditional forms of agriculture, like sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Other contributions to Southern poverty were the South's late start to industrialization. So again, if you think about the North, they started in like the 1820s, 1830s with that early Industrial Revolution. And then the Civil War really accelerated that. The South isn't starting until after the Civil War. In addition to that, they didn't invest in education. So remember, we talked about way back when with like education reform, Southerners kind of rejected that because they felt as though they had a different lifestyle, that they didn't need to invest public tax dollars into schools. They did not invest in technical schools or engineering. The political leadership of the South, so those redeemers, the Democrats, did not support the education of poor whites or poor blacks. It just wasn't, that's just not where they felt like their money should go. And if you look at per pupil spending today, if you look at like the bottom of the list, most of them are in the South, the deep South, like Mississippi and Alabama. And so in some regards, things have not changed all that much. Between 1870 and 1900, the number of acres planted in cotton more than doubled. So the supply was high. This caused the world markets to drop by almost 50%. So everyone's growing cotton because they feel like that's what's going to get them wealthy. There was a panic that we talked about in 1873 where cotton prices really weren't even able to kind of adjust back from that. So with that, there's going to be a lot of poverty. Think about those sharecroppers and the tenant farmers that are have a lot of expenses, or they have to give over half of their crop. Also keep in mind, like as a sharecropper, they're only given like 20 to 30 acres of land. Like it's very difficult to make money when you don't have a lot of land to grow or to harvest cotton from. You're kind of limited in that regard, which is again going to lead to this kind of this cyclical poverty and cyclical debt. In addition to that, there are not a lot of banks. And so the line of credit is short for a lot of them. And not really being willing to take out loans. The banks aren't really willing to give those to them. Discontent resulted in the Farmers Southern Alliance. So it had 1 million people that had joined, where they were trying to, basically it's kind of like the Farmers Alliance is kind of like a community where they can help support one another. It's kind of like a union, except they can't control like the price of crops. Like that's just not something that they have the ability to do. I think the most important thing from this era is that poor whites and blacks had a lot in common in reality, especially if you look at the economic situation. Economically, they were very similar. Now, politically and socially, obviously, African Americans were discriminated but much more, obviously, than whites. Like whites were the ones discriminating against them. But economically, and if they had ever been able to, if whites had been able to put aside the racism component, and again, this is like very similar to even what happened before the Civil War, if they could have put that aside and they could have realized that economically they could benefit if they would unite or align themselves with African Americans at this point in time, they would have been able to have political control that could help them economically. But because they were so worried about this like class struggle, and that they were so worried about seeing them as equals or whatever it was, that they weren't able to help themselves economically. And again, it's really interesting even today that a lot of poor rural whites who vote typically for the Republican Party, and African Americans that vote typically for the Democratic Party, economically, it would make sense if they voted together. Right? If you think about minimum wage, if you're living in rural Appalachia and the only jobs that you have are fast food restaurants, and the same thing like in urban areas with minimum wage, like if you really think about it, they could become a very large, voting bloc if they could vote together and kind of get some things done. So after 1877, with the end of Reconstruction and the soldiers are removed, in come the redeemers, the white supremacists. Back come the black codes that we had talked about that states had passed early in Reconstruction, but then were overturned with the 14th Amendment. The civil rights, or the slaughterhouse cases in the Supreme Court, really reversed a lot of the progress that was made with the 14th Amendment. Basically what it did is it allowed for Southern states to interpret it a little bit more broadly. The most important case is probably Plessy versus Ferguson, where it upheld Louisiana's law of requiring separate but equal accommodations. They said that that is constitutionally appropriate, that it does not deny anyone due process under the 14th Amendment. However, we know that they were not equal. So this allowed for legal segregation in this case, it was train cars. So train cars, schools, public buildings, libraries, right, post offices, anything and everything. And then as well for that, that's just public. In addition to that, private. So businesses and things like that. So these federal court decisions, so between the slaughterhouse cases and Plessy versus Ferguson, allowed for these Jim Crow laws to be established. And Jim Crow is, and this was part of our daily doc assignment, once you watch that, Jim Crow is this character that was created that kind of symbolizes this not even stereotypical African-American man that basically in this mocking gesture. And so they call them Jim Crow laws, basically kind of making fun of African Americans, but we know them as segregation laws. So in addition to economic discrimination, you have political discrimination and disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South during this time period. So literacy tests were, and again, each state is different. One thing that we learned in 2020 is that the Constitution delegates the power of elections to each state. So each state had different laws. These are some of the common ones that you would see. So a literacy test is, they would give you this test. You have a certain number of minutes to complete it. You couldn't miss it. Any questions? Most of the time they were impossible tests to take. And these existed all the way up through the 1960s, up until the Voting Rights Act was passed. Poll taxes as well, so that you had to pay money in order to be able to vote. So it kind of stripped people of that were like socioeconomically lower. The goal, though, again, was to isolate African Americans in most of these cases. But the problem is that a lot of poor whites, when certain states and certain counties were actually enforcing these laws, it was stripping poor whites of their voting rights. And so they came up with laws like the grandfather clause, where you are only allowed to vote if your grandfather casts a ballot in elections before the Civil War, for example. And so therefore that would deny all African Americans, because they didn't have the right to vote. They weren't considered citizens. And so that's how they kind of fixed some of those problems. But in a lot of the southern states, poll taxes and literacy tests existed well into the 1960s and 1970s, even in some cases, depending on when certain federal laws were passed to fix that. The Supreme Court's going to uphold literacy tests even in 1898. So again, kind of showing the consistency in the Supreme Court in allowing states to do that. African Americans were not allowed to sit on juries. If they were convicted of crimes, statistically, they had higher punishments. That's something that you even see today. Lynch mobs killed more than 1,400 men in the 1890s. Lynching is something that is difficult to kind of understand and to describe. It is more than just a hanging. It's torture, and it's kind of this vigilante idea of most of the lynchings that took place in the South, and men and women, and actually some white people were also lynched during these years. But it kind of came from, like, the root of it started with African Americans during this time period as a way to intimidate them and to kind of keep them subordinate. And children were oftentimes invited to these events in order to kind of teach the next generation. And in most cases, these people were accused of a crime, were in jail, had been arrested, were in jail, and mobs stormed the jails and, like, basically take the person out of the jail cell and then lynch them. So there's no due process there. And we'll talk more about lynching with Ida B. Wells. Economic discrimination is going to keep African Americans from getting industrial jobs. Poor whites and immigrants are going to learn those skills that are going to help them move through the middle class in the 20th century, where African Americans are denied that ability. And again, it's going to kind of trap them in sharecropping and tenant farming. They're going to also, in addition to that, a common job occupation that was deemed appropriate for African Americans is going to be some type of domestic work. So for women, it was like cooks and nannies and housekeepers. For African American men, same thing, cooks, and especially like even when we get to the world wars, you'll see that as well, as where they were only allowed to be cooks. But again, low-paying jobs that, again, denied them that upward mobility that a lot of poor whites were able to experience in the 20th century. So Ida B. Wells was a woman that created a newspaper, an anti-lynching newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech, where she really focused on anti-lynching. She was pushing for anti-lynching laws and Jim Crow laws, and really like pointed out the injustices in her newspaper. She had numerous death threats. They burned down her printing press, and it forced her to leave Memphis, Tennessee, and go up north to finish out continue her work. Bishop Henry Turner formed the International Migration Society in 1894, where it was giving African Americans the option to immigrate to Africa if they wanted to. And that's kind of it's interesting because there's even going to be another movement in the 1920s where African Americans are tired of the discrimination, and their thought is that maybe if we can get out of the United States away from this discrimination, that we'll have a better shot at living a life free of that. Another example of African Americans trying to get out of the South is going to be the Exodusters. We've kind of mentioned them already. Some African Americans were able to immigrate to Kansas or Oklahoma after the Civil War during Reconstruction in the New South in order to try and escape the Klan and the systematic discrimination, even though the social discrimination and economic discrimination is still going to follow them. So, responding to segregation, there are two main men that you need to know. Booker T. Washington was a former slave, educated at the Hampton Institute, and was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1881. His view on how to improve the lives of African Americans in the country really focused on the economic part. So that's why he founded Tuskegee Institute. He wanted to use education and to teach African Americans other skills besides manual labor in agriculture. So industrial, so skills, so masonry and carpentry, blacksmithing, things like that. Agricultural school, to the extent of where it was teaching them how to like business wise, like how to kind of try to be a profitable farmer, even though that wasn't even a thing for whites at this point in time. It was very difficult to do. He argued that economically, if African Americans can economically support themselves and support one another, that is how they will be lifted out of the situation in which they are in, and that will open the eyes to whites to where they will have more see more social equality and then political equality. He founded the Negro Business League. There were 320 chapters nationwide to support Black-owned businesses, and there were areas of the South where you had Black Wall Streets, if you will, where they were highly profitable businesses where they supported each other and they were able to kind of move up and create like a Black middle class like in these towns. And there was one in Durham. Wilmington was fairly successful, had a fairly successful Black community during these years up until the 1890s. There were multiple little examples of this. White people really liked Booker T. Washington's view. They believed that he was being realistic. He wasn't demanding the things that Du Bois was, which was more about like social and political first. He's quoted as using this quote where he talked about, you got to lift yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's kind of controversial today because most African Americans didn't even have boots to lift themselves up by. But again, there were, in some examples, it was kind of the right idea. He was just less idealistic, I think, and more of a realist. He knew that they were going to be discriminated against no matter what. So why not create communities where they could lift each other up economically? That's not going to change the minds of whites that are still denying them political participation and, terrorizing them, because of voting or for opening a new school or because of something that their church does. But this was his view on how to help African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois was also a Black man, and he had a completely different view on how to help African Americans in this time of segregation. And he was very critical of Booker T. He kind of almost hinted at the fact that he had given up and almost like an Uncle Tom type criticism, where he felt like he was just giving up to the white man and that they were okay with being inferior and we'll just kind of, help each other, just kind of settling. Where Du Bois was much more idealistic. He wanted an immediate end to segregation, all civil rights, and that economic independence could not happen until there was political and social equality. He would be someone that in the 1950s and 60s, right? He was just kind of ahead of his time a little bit. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, white communities just were nowhere near thinking on Du Bois's level. They liked the idea more of what Booker T. Washington was saying. But again, he had the right idea. It's just he was kind of, he was considered a radical, if you will. And he also had a very different upbringing. He did not live in slavery. He was highly educated. And so his views too were a little bit different. He wasn't from the South, where Booker T. Washington was from the South. So he knew kind of what was really facing them. I think that both men were right. I think a combination of the both was needed for sure. You need the economic support of one another, but also these poll taxes and, political discrimination should also not be happening. That needs to be remedied. So by 1900, all farmers, white and Black, Western and Southerners all face the same problems, and you need to know these. So why are they all facing these problems? One is falling prices. American farms are increasing their production. They are much more efficient in what they are doing. In addition to that, other countries are getting the technology to also become more efficient, like Argentina, Canada, Russia. And they're growing their own wheat and corn and things like that. So the world's supply, the global supply of these crops has gone up, where America was kind of leading the way for a lot of crops and farmers for exports. Now other countries are kind of catching up. And so the supply is really high, which means the prices are going to drop. Money supply was also really low. The economy was growing, but we're going to talk more in the next unit about fiscal policy and the money question, where the economy is growing, but where is the actual money? Because we were still on the gold standard. So each dollar was valued a little bit higher. So that's the deflation of money, which is really hard to understand. I'll explain it once we are back in school. So as prices fell, farmers were faced with mortgages. They had bills that they had to pay. And they had, so they had to take out more, an additional loans in order to pay off others. There were liens on their property. Interest rates were extremely high. So the rate at which they're borrowing money could be 10, 20%, probably more like 20%, which makes it almost impossible for you to pay it back. Meanwhile, the banks are getting very, very rich during these years. So it's this vicious cycle of more debt, foreclosures, and so they're losing their land, and then they're having to become tenant farmers and sharecroppers, which is not the American dream at all whatsoever. In addition to that, you have rising costs. So prices are dropping, costs to be a farmer is going up. Corporations are able to keep prices high on manufactured goods. So the things that you're buying, a lot of trusts are being formed at this point in time. So these are monopolies, and we'll talk about this in the next unit. And so in addition to that, there are high railroad costs. That was probably the biggest thing. And then also to store your grain. So they had a ton of expenses that continued to go up, but yet they're selling their crops for less and less. Okay. In addition to that, you had taxes that were going up for property, income tax, high tariffs, because the Republican Party is in control and they like tariffs to promote American business. So it's not even like you have an option to buy goods from another country. In addition to that, you have tariffs that are being slapped on American farmers because tariffs have been placed on them. And so a lot of this fiscal policy of the time is benefiting the industrialists, the Republican Party, more so than the American people. So you have the Grange, which is formed by Oliver H. Kelly in 1868. Originally, it was established as an educational organization, a social, like to get the farmers and their families together. But within 5 years, it's in every single state. Most in the Midwest. The Midwest is kind of like the home to the Grange. It's kind of funny to say. As it expanded, though, it started getting more active in the economics and the politics of it to really kind of help the farmers. So instead of it just being something that where, it's this community group, now it's like they're looking at the economic policy and the political part, what could help them politically so that they could be economically more successful. And so they started to establish cooperatives. So cooperatives are these ways in which, like today we have cooperatives that are like artisans and like small farmers even today, where like you guys, so if one person grows like sweet potato, I always think of it like as a farmer's market, right? So you guys, people get together in order to benefit each and every person in order to sell, like one common place where you can sell your goods. And it benefits everyone because it's easier than going to one farm for this thing and one farm for another. They're all located kind of in one place. They're also art cooperatives. So where like artists and craftsmen all go in on like a rent space, and they rent little parts of a floor, and it benefits everyone that way. And it's also not as expensive too, right? Imagine having like for a small craftsman to rent out like a huge space or even a small space, like that's a really big expense. But if you share it with other artisans, it's a little bit more cost effective. So pooling their resources, they're cutting out the middlemen, and they're trying to be able to make more money. In Midwestern states, they passed laws that regulated rates that were charged by railroads. So these Granger laws are state laws that would make it illegal for railroads to fix prices. So again, you have to imagine that the monopolies exist during this time period. And individual states started to pass laws that limited that, okay? In Munn v. Illinois, the Supreme Court upheld the right of a state to regulate a business such as the railroads. And so the most important thing, because this is going to get a little confusing, Munn v. Illinois was a victory for farmers. It said, yeah, they can do that. They can limit that within their state, okay? They can limit railroads within their state. The problem is that railroads are interstate businesses. They travel from one state to the other. And that's actually a federal issue. And so railroads basically started to, initially railroads are going to adapt to the Granger laws, and they're just going to raise the costs, especially those long hauls that are for interstate travel. Most farmers use interstate travel, so it's very expensive. So the next Supreme Court case is Wabash v. Illinois, where the Supreme Court says that individual states cannot regulate interstate commerce. So it nullified a lot of those Granger laws, a lot of those state laws. Congress is going to respond because the farmers are upset because they're like, listen, we're just trying to make a living and these big corporations are taking advantage of us, the little guy. So Congress responds and they passed the first piece of legislation that's going to limit, right? So big government limiting commerce and industry, which is the Railroad Act, or the railroads. So they passed the Interstate Commerce Act, where it required that railroad rates be reasonable and just. It was a good attempt, for sure. It is that first step in the government realizing that capitalism maybe has its weaknesses, and it maybe, once you start getting monopolies and it limits that free market component, that it needs to be regulated in order to make sure that capitalism is being effective. And so, but again, it's very broad. Like, how do you decide what's reasonable and just? They do establish the Interstate Commerce Commission, and they are the ones that have the power to investigate these groups. The ICC is still around today. In the end, it actually ended up helping railroads because there was all this competition between different railroads, that it allowed for them to, they were able to kind of create prices where they couldn't go any lower. And so it stabilized rates and it helped with the competition a little bit. In the long term, though, this is kind of the beginning of needing laws and the federal government to step in and help the little guy, help the farmers. This is going to move into kind of the progressive era, where the federal government comes in and starts passing laws to help the American people as capitalism gets too big. Okay. In the next chapter, in my next lecture, I'm going to talk about industrialization and the era of monopolies and the Gilded Age, the robber barons and captains of industry, where it'll make a little bit more sense as to what the railroads were kind of accomplishing at this point in time. Okay, so I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.